Welcome to another episode of Legal Lunch Byte. Really happy today to have Hirsh Jain joining us from Ananda Strategy. Hirsh, thanks for spending some time with us today. I'd love to hear more about your background. You and I are just meeting for the first time, so we like to keep these very natural, but I know you've been working with our firm a little bit, so please give us some of your background professionally, and then start out with how you got involved in cannabis.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be here with you, Jonathan. I have been working in the cannabis space for 6 years now formally, but really, cannabis has been a big part of my life for a long time. I grew up in Northern California, and like many, kids of Northern California of my generation, we were introduced to cannabis at a young age, probably younger than we should have. But, it made an enormously positive impact, sort of on my life. And I very quickly understood that a lot of what I was told about cannabis was inaccurate, even as a young person. So that was a real light bulb moment for me. And as time went on, I got more and more involved with cannabis advocacy efforts. And so when I went to college at UC Berkeley, I joined the public defender's office as the cannabis lead, which would essentially be defending students that were accused of cannabis violations by the university, which back then, could impact your financial aid or potentially get you kicked out of school. And so that kind of animated my interest in criminal justice issues. And then when I went to law school at Harvard, I did a lot of work on the war on drugs and was really lucky to study with really eminent legal scholars, people like Charles Ogletree, who passed away last year and was one of the great race and criminal justice scholars of his time, people like Lonnie Guinair, who passed away a couple of years ago and, worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So that sort of academic lens on the war on drugs was very enriching. And then finally, Jonathan, I think like many people, over the course of my career, I developed a set of skills that I thought could be applicable to cannabis. And I watched the growing cannabis movement with enthusiasm and interest, and then, jumped into it 6 years ago. And, kind of in short, before I was working in cannabis, I worked at Airbnb, the tech company, for a number of years and helped to build out their policy team, legalizing Airbnb in cities and states and in countries around the world. And I had this thesis that same skill set, helping a newly legalizing industry build a regulatory architecture around it, could be applicable to cannabis. And so that's what motivated me to jump into cannabis. And it's been the most fulfilling thing that I've done in my career.
Fantastic. And so tell us what Ananda Strategy does.
Yeah, so at Ananda Strategy, we work with all kinds of actors, in the cannabis ecosystem. And really what we do is we help them make sense of a very complicated and evolving regulatory environment and allow them to achieve their goals in the context of that shifting regulatory environment. So, a number of the folks that we've worked with are some of the leading retailers in the country. So if, we're talking about California, which is where I'm speaking to you from right now, companies like The Artistry, companies like Airfield, companies like Wheelhouse, helping them identify the jurisdictions where they can open up new dispensaries and be really successful. And, it's a really exciting thing to help bring cannabis to a community and help the community understand that this can be a successful and professional retail business. So we work with a lot of retailers. We also work with a ton of brands and help them, after they've established a successful brand, navigate other states and determine, where they should enter, what the regulatory environment is, what kind of regulatory issues they'll face in those states. And so these are brands, really cool brands like Mammoth Distribution, for example, which has famously the Heavy Hitters vape product, and Almora, another popular brand. Helping that really great and popular brand expand into other states is really exciting. And, another example that I'll give you is a product called Level, a very unique pro tab product. It basically resembles kind of a pharmaceutical pill and is a high dose cannabis product that can be useful to people who are experiencing more kind of acute issues post-surgery. And so that kind of represents the future of cannabis consumption. And it's been fun to make that product available in these states in the Midwest and across the country. So those are a couple of examples when it comes to brands and retailers. We also serve on the board of SC Labs, which is one of the leading testing labs in the country. And I know labs are less sexy to some people, but if the legal market is going to function as it should, we need that to have integrity. And we also work with some of the leading investment firms in the country, and again help them make sense of how things are evolving at the state level. And how that might impact their portfolio companies. So it's just a pleasure to work with all of these different types of actors of different sizes and help them achieve their goals in light of the regulatory knowledge that we bring.
And so which states are you particularly interested in, or what's maybe some interesting things going on in various states? I'm not, so I started out my background, legal industry for 13 years now. Started out in Maine when cannabis started coming online in Maine around 2014. And then I joined the firm here to join the China practice because I speak Chinese. And then I found out we had a cannabis wing, and I needed to help there initially. So I dove in deep into cannabis for a while, but I have not for the last couple of years. I've kept one eye on the screen really, but haven't done a lot deep into cannabis. So just from where you're sitting, what are some of the interesting state developments, and which states are these?
I think two of the most exciting states to me right now are Ohio and Florida. And these are two states that are exciting, I think, for very similar reasons. And so, Ohio last November voted to approve adult use sales, and legal sales in Ohio could literally start any day now. They'll probably happen sometime in late June. And the reason why Ohio is so exciting is it's the first big red state to legalize adult use cannabis. Now, we've had other small states that are red, say Montana, Missouri, and Alaska come online. But Ohio is the quintessential Republican state. No Republican has ever won the White House without winning Ohio. And the fact that Ohio passed cannabis legalization by such a wide margin over the objections of their conservative state legislature really shows you how bipartisan an issue this is. And so Ohio is very symbolically exciting. And, in addition to being a big state of 12 million people, it's also situated in a region of the country that is pretty conservative. So in addition to those 12 million people, there are millions of people from West Virginia, from Kentucky, from Indiana, from Western Pennsylvania that will be an hour or two from a legal adult use dispensary for the first time. And so I see Ohio as really opening up that part of the Midwest. For so long, cannabis legalization has been a coastal phenomenon, and Ohio is anything but that. So I'm so excited for there to be a great summer of robust cannabis sales in Ohio, and for those headlines to really bubble up throughout the country. And, the second state that I'll flag is Florida, which I think is exciting for many of the same reasons. I think anyone who's been paying attention to American politics, especially over the past 5 to 10 years, knows that Florida is kind of the epicenter of deep red politics in this country right now. And, Florida this November will vote on cannabis legalization, and they make it a little bit harder in Florida. It's the only state where you have to get 60% of the vote, not just 50. So it's an uphill climb. But I believe Florida will pass. And again, I think Florida will be exciting for many of the same reasons as Ohio. It is a big red state. There's 23 million people there. It will show that even in red America, these are considered freedom issues now. Cannabis is not considered a cultural sin, but, has a freedom orientation. And then, finally, I'll just say again, Florida, in addition to those 23 million people, is kind of the only state that touches almost every other state in the Deep South. Like Jacksonville and Tallahassee are right on the Georgia border. Pensacola, Florida is right there near Mississippi and Louisiana. And so I see Florida as really opening up the Deep South, which thus far has been an island of prohibition. And then finally, Florida gets 140 million tourists a year, many of them international tourists. If we can show the rest of the world that there is a safe and regulated, way to manage cannabis, then I think it can really have impacts, especially across the Western Hemisphere. So I'm so excited about those states, and I think everyone should be too.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Thank you. So on the federal level, and I've seen the headlines, but haven't dove too deeply into what's happening now. What kind of the federal policy developments are significant right now or on the horizon?
I think the main one is federal rescheduling. And look, I think we could spend an hour or two trying to unpack this very complicated issue. So I'll do my best to just provide a brief synopsis. I think what is exciting is, as many folks, watching this may already know, the Biden administration has, requested a rescheduling of cannabis, believing that, cannabis belongs as a Schedule 3 drug rather than a Schedule 1 drug. Again, as many folks may know, a Schedule 1 drug is a drug that's considered to have no medical value and a high potential for abuse. And cannabis has been on that schedule for a half a century, which is why cannabis prohibition has endured for so long. But the Biden administration, the Department of Health and Human Services recommended a rescheduling to Schedule 3. In recent months, the DOJ has proposed a rule that would kind of codify that rescheduling. Public comment on that rescheduling process ends on July 22nd. So we have about a month left. And, you know, as many folks watching this may know, there's a difference between a proposed rule and a final rule, of course. But I think there is, you know, a very strong likelihood that we could get a final rule that codifies cannabis as Schedule 3 before the presidential election. There's been a lot of speculation that, you know, Joe Biden will kind of use that as a feather in his cap as he attempts to win a second term. But, you know, the reason this is so exciting, and look, I know this is a complicated issue. There's some people who will properly identify that this doesn't go far enough, that alcohol and nicotine, you know, are not scheduled. And so cannabis being scheduled is not intellectually defensible. But nonetheless, this is the first crack in the armor of federal prohibition in half a century. It is the first time that the federal government has acknowledged the medical utility of cannabis. And perhaps crucially, it'll change the tax treatment of these cannabis businesses so they have a fighting chance at profitability. And if we want the cannabis movement in this country to succeed, we're going to need to have these be viable businesses. So I think that is something that everyone should be paying attention to around this fall as it gets finalized.
Excellent. So let's go international. This is where I spend most of my time thinking and doing work. What's happening on the international stage that is worth flagging for the audience today?
You know, I think what's exciting is now in the year 2024, we can more credibly say that cannabis is becoming a global phenomenon, and that in really every region of the globe, you're having people talk about cannabis for the first time, which represents a dramatic difference from where we were several years ago. And it's a reminder that the United States, for better and sometimes for worse, sometimes sets the table for the international agenda on issues like drugs. You know, it was the United States and our policy of drug prohibition that led the war on drugs to spread throughout the 20th century. And now we have the opportunity to hopefully lead in a better way. And so there's so much going on internationally, but perhaps one or two things that I'll call out as the most significant developments. One would be Germany. Everybody knows that Germany is the biggest economy in Europe. It's arguably the California, of Europe, and can, impact the rest of the continent. And as many folks may know, as of April 1st of this year, a landmark new legalization law in Germany took effect. Now, that law that passed will not resemble the commercial model that has evolved in the United States, but crucially what this law in Germany does that legalizes, that quote unquote legalizes cannabis, is that for the first time, it reclassifies cannabis not as a narcotic, but as something that has medical utility. So already in the past few months, you were seeing the rates of medical prescriptions in Germany expand exponentially. Germany is developing a medical cannabis market for the first time. So that's very exciting. And it kind of mirrors what's going on in the United States as we've reclassified cannabis. So that is exciting. And then also there is what you might call decriminalization going on. People who have small amounts of cannabis possession will not be criminally charged for having that. And so, look, there are some people that will point to the limitations of the German model. They will note that it will likely be several years before we see a robust commercial infrastructure there that mirrors what we have in the United States. And that's totally fair. But that is a momentous step forward for Germany. And you are already seeing the echoes of that in many other countries, whether it be France, whether it be Spain. You see prohibition, similar to what we're seeing in some states in the US, slowly start to melt away. And so I think that's one exciting development to pay attention to, which is what might happen, in Europe. And, I think another development that I'll point out is what has happened in Thailand. And I think Thailand is actually a little bit of a different story. Whereas Germany is proceeding incrementally, is saying, hey, let's classify this as a medicine and slowly build comfort with cannabis. Thailand, given its kind of fractional politics, had a coalition a couple years ago that essentially decriminalized cannabis entirely, that legalized it outright, which led to a proliferation of these cannabis establishments across the country. And the reason I bring up Thailand is that after this occurred, now with a new sort of coalition in power, there's been an effort to rein in that explosion of cannabis activity. And so I think Thailand both shows the promise that even in more conservative Asian countries, people are opening up to cannabis, but it also illustrates that drug policy reform is not linear, that, our goal here should be essentially shifting the Overton window incrementally over time to help build comfort with cannabis, and that there is a risk to moving too quickly and inspiring backlash. So I think Thailand also presents an interesting lesson. And, perhaps the final thing I'll note, and, we probably don't have time to go through all of these examples, is that there are so many major countries across the world that are tackling cannabis for the first time, whether it's Australia, and they're building up of a medical pipeline, or South Africa that recently repealed one of the last apartheid laws, which criminalized cannabis and is now slowly and steadily legalizing cannabis. And so I'll conclude by saying what is so exciting is that you have all of these organic developments around the world. And if the US really steps up, it has the potential to influence a lot of those countries around the world towards better drug policy.
Excellent. This has been fascinating. 15 minutes goes by very quickly, but really appreciate your time today and sharing your expertise. And certainly we'll look forward to following Ananda Strategy and all the good things you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me.